In the closing years of the 19th century, as the United States was being violently reshaped by the forces of industrialization, there remained a stretch of land in western North Carolina that seemed almost untouched by modern life. The Blue Ridge Mountains extended endlessly across the horizon. Ancient forests clung to the slopes. Morning fog drifted slowly through deep valleys, and the people who lived there moved to a rhythm that the financial world of New York could scarcely imagine. It was in this place, one that appeared forgotten by time, that one of the most ambitious private constructions in American history began to take shape. Not through the roar of factories or the black smoke of steel mills, but through a very different idea of power, culture, and permanence. The man who carried that idea was George Washington Vanderbilt II. Within the Vanderbilt family, his name had never been synonymous with supreme business power. He was neither the architect of the railroad empire nor a manipulator of markets who shook Wall Street. George Vanderbilt was, in many ways, an outsider within his own dynasty. He loved books, art, European architecture, and the values he believed young America still lacked. In an era when wealth was most often displayed through speed, scale, and industrial might, Vanderbilt pursued the opposite: refinement, order, and the inherited traditions of the old world. The idea of a vast estate did not come to him as an investment project or a symbol of ostentation. It came slowly, during long journeys through France and England, where he encountered castles and aristocratic estates, built not merely for living, but for transmitting a worldview across generations. Thick stone walls, carefully planned gardens, libraries filled with accumulated knowledge, and landscapes shaped with deliberate intent. Vanderbilt began to imagine that if America wished to become a true civilization, and not merely an economic power, it, too, required such symbols. Yet when this idea was brought back to the United States, it immediately collided with the realities of the Gilded Age. This was a period in which wealth was created at an unprecedented pace, but also an era marked by deep inequality, exploited labor, and the relentless consumption of nature. Within that context, setting aside thousands of acres of land to build a private estate, one that served neither industrial production nor direct a public need, was both a bold and controversial decision, even if few at the time dared to openly question a Vanderbilt. George Vanderbilt selected a vast tract of land near the city of Asheville, where the rolling terrain allowed him to recreate the landscapes he had admired in Europe. He did not merely purchase land, he acquired an entire ecosystem. Thousands of acres of forest, pasture, and valley were assembled into a single, unified whole. From the beginning, Vanderbilt envisioned this place not simply as a large house, but as a closed world, one in which architecture, landscape, and human activity would operate according to an order he defined. To turn this vision into reality, Vanderbilt sought out the finest minds of his era. He commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt, whose mastery of classical European styles allowed them to be translated into an American context. At the same time, he enlisted Frederick Law Olmsted, the creator of Central Park, to shape the surrounding landscape. This was no longer a solitary personal project. It became a convergence of intellectual, artistic, and technical forces at the highest level, all directed toward the creation of a symbol without precedent on American soil. But from the earliest days, the seeds of loss of control quietly took root. The scale of the project continued to expand. Initial plans quickly became obsolete as new demands emerged. Each space required another room. Each room required additional detail. Each detail carried new costs and extended timelines. There was no clear boundary between enough and not enough, because Vanderbilt's dream itself had no defined endpoint. He was not building to sell, not building for profit, and felt no pressure to optimize. In his world, perfection held greater value than any number. When construction officially began, hundreds then thousands of workers poured into this remote region. Temporary rail lines were laid solely to transport materials. Stone, steel, timber, and decorative elements arrived from across the world. A massive logistical network formed for the sole purpose of serving a private estate. For local residents, this was both an opportunity for employment and a signal that a new kind of power was being imposed upon their familiar landscape. At the center of it all, George Vanderbilt observed, adjusted, and continued to dream. He believed he was doing something right for America, that one day this estate would stand as proof of the young nation's cultural capacity. But history rarely follows human intention. What began as a dream of order and beauty was gradually becoming a vast machine, one that consumed resources, time, and ultimately the stability of the Vanderbilt family itself. And this was only the beginning of the story. For the estate known as Biltmore was not merely a reflection of one man's ambition. It mirrored the deeper contradictions of America's Gilded Age, between civilization and display, between ideals and consequences, between the legacy one wishes to leave behind and the price that history ultimately demands. Once the estate project had crossed the boundary between a large residence and a self-contained architectural and landscape system, its pace began to accelerate in ways that even its originator found difficult to control. Early decisions, once driven by aesthetics and ideals, now set off chains of practical consequences. Money had to flow continuously, materials had to arrive on schedule, and human labor had to be organized with the precision of an industrial operation, even though the goal was not production, but perfection. In the quiet of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a machine of luxury was coming to life, operating day and night. At the heart of that machine stood the main house itself, a château inspired by the French Renaissance, with its monumental facade, steep roofs, towers, and hundreds of interior spaces, defined down to their smallest function. Each room was not merely meant to be used, but to communicate something about knowledge, cultural authority, and continuity. The library had to be vast enough to hold tens of thousands of volumes. The dining hall had to rival those of European estates. Corridors had to stretch long enough to create a sense of order removed from ordinary life. Architecture here did not serve convenience, it served atmosphere. Alongside the house, the surrounding landscape was reshaped on a scale rarely attempted. Forests were selectively cleared to open long visual corridors. Pastures were reorganized to create rhythm and balance. Formal gardens were composed like music, with movement, pause, and climax. Notably, unlike many lavish projects of the era, this estate was not entirely indifferent to the natural world. Early principles of scientific forestry, sustainable land use, and soil restoration were applied, reflecting a belief that nature could and should be managed responsibly. Yet it was precisely this combination of conservation ideals and immense scale that made the project even more expensive. Costs rose not because of simple waste, but because there was no fixed definition of what enough meant. When a good solution was found, it was quickly replaced by a better one. When a space appeared complete, it was revised again to better align with the whole. In the logic of this project, completion was never final, it was temporary. And because George Vanderbilt faced no pressure from shareholders or markets, there was no force strong enough to compel restraint. For the labor force, the estate became an unprecedented center of employment in the region. Thousands of workers took part in different stages of construction: masons, carpenters, stone cutters, decorators, gardeners, engineers, and managers. A temporary community formed around the project, its daily life revolving around construction schedules and deliveries. Yet this dependence also created a fragile relationship. When livelihoods are tied to a single personal vision, prosperity becomes vulnerable to any shift in the will or finances of its owner. At a deeper level, the project revealed a fundamental contradiction of the Gilded Age. On one hand, it expressed the belief that wealth could be transformed into culture, that money was not merely to be accumulated, but to be shaped into something enduring. On the other hand, the very scale of that transformation relied on an economic system that allowed resources to concentrate almost without limit in the hands of one individual. The estate thus became a symbol of both aspirations at once noble and unsettling. As construction moved closer to completion, financial pressure began to make itself quietly felt, even if it was rarely spoken of openly. Enormous expenditures were covered by family assets, while the estate itself generated virtually no direct income. This was not a business. It was a long-term commitment to beauty. But history shows that such commitments are rarely immune to time, especially when they are bound to a single person. Most contemporaries saw only the surface grandeur of the project. Few questioned its sustainability, because the Vanderbilt name itself seemed to guarantee permanence. Yet even at the height of this ambition, small cracks had already begun to form, not in stone or steel, but in the financial structure and in the underlying assumption that a personal dream, no matter how magnificent, could endure forever. The estate continued to grow, continued to be refined, and continued to consume resources at a steady and troubling pace. And as the great doors prepared to open to the world, the central question was no longer whether the project was magnificent, but how much it would demand to be maintained and who, in the long run, would pay the price for such magnificence. When the great doors of the estate were finally opened in the winter of 1895, the moment was quickly recognized by America's elite as a milestone. Against the snow-covered backdrop of North Carolina's mountains, the shadow appeared like a fragment of Europe, transplanted onto American soil, both unfamiliar and overwhelming. The first guests moved through illuminated halls, beneath soaring ceilings and along endless corridors, where every detail had been calculated to evoke permanence. On the surface, this was a moment of triumph. Beneath it, however, it marked the beginning of a quiet paradox that would shape the estate's future. George Vanderbilt did not stage a grand social spectacle in the conventional sense. He did not seek public admiration, nor did he intend the estate to function as a glittering stage for political or financial networking. Instead, he envisioned Biltmore as a private sanctuary, an ordered world where knowledge and culture could be preserved from the chaos of modern life. Nowhere was this vision clearer than in the library, whose tens of thousands of volumes reflected not display, but conviction. It was an unspoken declaration that culture itself could serve as a form of power. Yet this very privacy placed Biltmore in an uneasy position among the great estates of its era. While many mansions of the Gilded Age were designed to host lavish gatherings and reinforce social hierarchies, Biltmore resisted that function. It was too vast to be a simple family home, yet too inward-looking to serve as a true center of social power. From the moment it was completed, the estate carried an unmistakable sense of isolation. Daily life at Biltmore unfolded not in constant spectacle, but in disciplined quiet. A large staff maintained order, tended the grounds, preserved interiors, and ensured readiness even during the owner's frequent absences. To an outsider, this silence might suggest tranquility. But for an estate of such scale, silence carried a cost. Rooms without occupants still required heating. Systems had to remain operational. A complex infrastructure continued to function without producing corresponding income. In 1898, George Vanderbilt's marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser introduced a subtle but decisive shift. Edith was practical, socially astute, and keenly aware of the pressures beneath the surface grandeur. She did not reject her husband's cultural vision, but she clearly recognized its financial and structural vulnerabilities. Under her influence, the estate began slowly and cautiously to open itself toward the outside world, even if its fundamental character remained unchanged. At the same time, the broader American landscape was evolving. The Gilded Age was entering a period of public reckoning, as debates over inequality, taxation, and the social responsibilities of wealth grew increasingly prominent. Private palaces that had once symbolized success now attracted skepticism. Within this changing climate, Biltmore could no longer exist solely as an isolated retreat. It became an image onto which the contradictions of the era were projected. George Vanderbilt himself was not a central figure in political controversy, yet he could not escape these larger forces. He continued to invest in the maintenance and refinement of the estate, but with each passing year it became clearer that Biltmore did not sustain itself through ideals alone. Costs accumulated steadily, while the symbolic value of the estate far exceeded its ability to generate income. What had been built to endure was now increasingly dependent on the stability of one man and one family. As the new century approached, Biltmore stood at a silent crossroads. Outwardly, it remained one of the most magnificent private estates in America. Inwardly, unanswered questions were taking shape. Could a symbol born from personal vision adapt to a society undergoing rapid transformation? And could the very silence that once defined the estate become a burden in a world growing louder, faster, and less forgiving? Those questions would not be answered immediately, but they had already begun to shape Biltmore's destiny, quietly preparing it for the trials that lay ahead, as history began to test the limits of every dream built on excess. As the 20th century began, the atmosphere surrounding the estate could no longer remain completely insulated from the outside world. America's pulse was changing. Cities were expanding, the middle class was growing, and questions of social justice were moving from academic debate into public life. In this shifting landscape, the great symbols of the Gilded Age began to be viewed differently. What had once been praised as personal achievement increasingly appeared as evidence of imbalance. Biltmore, with its unprecedented scale, was no exception. For George Vanderbilt, this change unfolded quietly but persistently. He was not an industrialist aggressively expanding new enterprises to offset rising costs. Much of his wealth remained tied to inherited assets and conservative investments. Meanwhile, the estate continued to demand enormous fixed expenses, staff salaries, building maintenance, landscape care, and the operation of complex systems designed for 19th-century luxury. Year after year, the gap between the cost of upkeep and the estate's ability to generate value grew increasingly apparent. Edith Vanderbilt, guided by a sharp sense of practicality, began to push for measures aimed at survival. Agricultural operations within the estate were reorganized to improve efficiency, not only to preserve the landscape but also to produce income. Experiments in livestock management, crop cultivation, and scientific forestry expanded, reflecting an effort to transform a cultural dream into something partially self-sustaining. Even so, these improvements could not fully counterbalance the immense costs imposed by a residence of such scale. Beyond the estate, public attitudes toward extreme wealth continued to evolve. progressive reform movements raised questions about taxation, labor conditions, and the social obligations of the affluent. Private palaces that once symbolized success now became targets of scrutiny. Although geographically distant from political centers, Biltmore could not remain untouched by this climate. It stood as a living relic of a social order whose legitimacy was increasingly being challenged. George Vanderbilt's health began to decline during this period, adding another layer of uncertainty to the estate's future. Though deeply attached to Biltmore as an extension of his identity, he became less directly involved in its daily management. Practical responsibility gradually shifted to Edith, who faced the dual burden of honoring her husband's vision while confronting the hard limits imposed by finance and history. The estate, once a pure expression of aspiration, was becoming a complex problem of stewardship. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, Biltmore entered an entirely new phase. His death marked not only a personal loss, but the end of the estate's original purpose as a living dream. No longer the direct expression of a single will, Biltmore became a legacy that had to be maintained in a world fundamentally different from the one that created it. Edith now stood before a difficult choice: preserve the estate as an untouched symbol of the past, or accept the changes necessary to ensure its survival. Her decisions did not come in a single dramatic moment, but through a series of small, practical, and often painful concessions. Certain areas were closed to reduce expenses. Long-standing traditions of excess were quietly scaled back. And for the first time, the idea of opening the estate to the public began to be seriously considered, even if it remained far from immediate realization. These steps signaled a profound shift. Biltmore was beginning to move away from its identity as a completely private refuge, and toward a future in which its existence would need to be justified to a broader society. This chapter of Biltmore's history lacked dramatic spectacle, yet its quietness carried deep historical weight. It revealed how a symbol of extraordinary luxury, built on faith in the permanence of wealth, began to be tested by time and social change. Biltmore still stood upon the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but its meaning was already shifting, from a personal dream to a collective question about legacy, responsibility, and the true cost of excess. The years following the First World War marked a period in which Biltmore could no longer remain quietly withdrawn within the stillness of the mountains. America was entering an era of rapid transition, uneven economic growth, deepening social divisions, and a fading memory of the world that had existed before the war. Within this new landscape, a vast estate operating under the assumptions of the 19th century appeared increasingly out of step. Not because it had lost its grandeur, but because the logic of its existence no longer aligned with the questions society was now asking. Edith Vanderbilt understood that time was no longer on the side of closed symbols. Maintaining Biltmore as a purely private domain meant continuing to absorb enormous costs with little means of relief. Yet opening it to the public carried a different kind of consequence. It required surrendering part of the original ideal that had guided George Vanderbilt's vision. This was not a purely commercial decision. It was a choice that struck at the identity of the estate itself. Was Biltmore meant to preserve a personal dream, or to adapt in order to remain alive within a changing society? The first steps were cautious and experimental. Agricultural and forestry operations were expanded further, not only as sources of revenue, but as a way of redefining the estate as a model of responsible land stewardship. Forests were managed scientifically, fields cultivated with intention, and the estate increasingly presented itself as an example of modern conservation. Yet even at peak efficiency, These efforts amounted to only a small stream compared to the vast ocean of costs required to sustain a house with hundreds of rooms. At the same time, public perceptions of private mansions continued to evolve. Structures once admired as symbols of individual success were now increasingly viewed as remnants of an outdated social order, one in which wealth had concentrated in the hands of very few. Biltmore, for all its beauty, became a visible question about the distribution of resources. It was within this tension that the idea of opening the estate to visitors shifted from an unthinkable notion to a practical consideration. Welcoming the public was no longer merely a financial strategy, it represented a reconfiguration of the relationship between the estate and society. Once the doors opened, even partially, Biltmore ceased to exist solely as a family world. It became a space where the public could confront the legacy of the Gilded Age directly. The long corridors, the grand rooms, and the carefully maintained gardens no longer told only a story of beauty. They invited reflection on cost, labor, and the historical choices that had made such beauty possible. This transformation did not occur quickly or completely. It unfolded slowly, step by step, as though the estate itself required time to adjust to its new role. Yet even in its early stages, the impact was unmistakable. Biltmore began to exist not just as private property, but as a shared memory in the process of being renegotiated. Every visitor, every article, every public discussion contributed to reshaping its meaning. At a deeper level, this shift reflected a broader movement within American society, a transition from celebrating private accumulation to questioning the social responsibility of legacy. Biltmore was neither demolished nor abandoned. It was preserved on the condition that it speak to more than one audience, and that it acknowledge not only its beauty and ambition, but also the limits and consequences of luxury pushed beyond control. This chapter of Biltmore's story carried no sudden tragedy, only a gradual change in state. A place once designed to stand apart from society was now compelled to enter into dialogue with it. And within that dialogue, Biltmore began to become something George Vanderbilt may never have fully imagined: a public symbol, where splendor and historical burden exist side by side. Once Biltmore began to assume a semi-public role, it did not immediately enter a period of stability. On the contrary, the decades that followed subjected the estate to challenges more severe than any it had previously faced. The Great Depression of the 1930s did not merely shatter financial markets or devastate working-class life. It brought an end to many models of luxury built on the assumption that wealth could remain static. In that climate, Biltmore was no longer simply the story of a family estate. It became a living case study in how a vast legacy must learn to survive. Economic collapse made the need for financial balance urgent. Income from agriculture and forestry, though carefully managed, could not offset the broader downturn. What had once been considered a temporary solution welcoming visitors gradually became a central pillar of survival. This shift required a subtle but profound change in how Biltmore presented itself. The estate no longer needed only to be preserved. It had to be explained, interpreted, and placed within a historical narrative compelling enough to convince the public that its continued existence was justified. This process forced those responsible for the estate to confront a difficult question: how much should remain untouched, and how much should adapt to new realities? Every decision involved compromise. Preserving every original detail safeguarded authenticity, but carried immense cost and limited access. Adjusting spaces to accommodate visitors ensured revenue but risked diluting the spirit of the original design. During this period, Biltmore existed in a fragile balance between preservation and adaptation. The Second World War further disrupted an already unstable rhythm. Resources were redirected toward the war effort, and tourism declined as society focused on survival rather than leisure. Yet it was precisely during these years that Biltmore began to be seen not merely as a financial burden, but as a cultural asset worthy of protection for future generations. Discussions about historic preservation, still relatively new in the United States, found concrete meaning in places like Biltmore. After the war, America entered a period of renewed growth, but its social order had shifted dramatically. Large private estates were no longer models of success to be emulated. New symbols of prosperity replaced them. In this changed landscape, Biltmore found stability not by competing with the present, but by standing apart from it as a witness to a bygone era. This repositioning allowed the estate to endure, not as a template for modern life, but as evidence of where the nation had been. Gradually, a new relationship formed between Biltmore and the public. Visitors arrived not only to admire luxury, but to understand the context that had produced it. Stories of labor, land management, financial decision-making, and moral consequence became inseparable from the experience. In its new role, Biltmore did not conceal its contradictions. It allowed them to remain visible as lessons rather than liabilities. By the latter half of the 20th century, the estate's survival no longer depended on illusions of endless private wealth, but on its ability to function as shared memory. It endured through interpretation, public engagement, and a willingness to accept that its value lay not in preserving an old dream intact, but in helping future generations understand both the beauty and the cost of that dream. By the latter half of the 20th century, Biltmore no longer needed to justify its existence through grandeur or scale. It had passed its most fragile period of survival, but only by undergoing a profound transformation in meaning. The estate was no longer perceived as the natural extension of a powerful family, but as a space of memory, one preserved not because it was flawless, but because it spoke honestly to the contradictions of its time. It was within this shift that Biltmore gradually found a more stable voice in American cultural life. The rise of cultural tourism after the war brought a new kind of audience. Visitors no longer came in search of a model life to admire, but to understand why such monumental dreams had once been built and why they could not remain intact forever. Tours, publications, and interpretations increasingly placed Biltmore within a broader historical narrative, where it stood alongside other symbols of the Gilded Age not as declarations, but as annotations. In this process, the way Biltmore's story was told began to change. Rather than focusing solely on architectural beauty and refined interiors, guides and historians introduced deeper layers: the labor that sustained the estate, the economic system that made it possible, and the social limits it quietly exposed. Biltmore was no longer shielded from difficult questions. Those questions became the very reason it mattered. Over time, the estate evolved into an informal educational space. Students of architecture, history, economics, and environmental studies came to examine a rare site where multiple historical currents converged. The management of land, the use of resources, and the transformation of a private fortune into a public legacy all became subjects of study. From a personal dream, Biltmore had become an open historical text. Yet becoming collective memory did not mean becoming neutral. Each generation approached Biltmore with its own concerns. To some, it stood as proof of humanity's capacity to create beauty that endures. To others, it symbolized the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few. These interpretations did not cancel one another out, they coexisted, reflecting the complexity of history itself. Biltmore offered no final verdict. It compelled reflection. At a deeper level, the estate's continued existence raised questions about present-day responsibility toward the past. Preserving Biltmore was not merely an act of protecting a beautiful structure, it was an ongoing negotiation with history. Every restoration decision, every curatorial choice, represented a judgment about what should be emphasized and what should remain silent. In this sense, Biltmore was never truly finished. It existed in a constant state of reinterpretation. By the close of the 20th century, Biltmore had moved far beyond the image of an estate living off inherited glory. It endured as a structure of memory, where beauty did not erase historical burden, and historical burden did not diminish beauty. This fragile balance allowed it to remain present, not as a monument to permanent power, but as evidence of a society learning how to confront its past. This chapter does not end with a single event, but with a condition. Biltmore stands still among the familiar hills, no longer the private dream of one man, but a shared space for reflection. And in that role, it quietly prepared for the final stage of its journey, becoming not just something remembered, but something used to think with about history, responsibility, and the meaning of legacy. As the 20th century drew to a close and the 21st century began, Biltmore no longer faced the question of whether it should exist. That debate had already been settled. The question had become more subtle and more demanding: how should it exist, and at what cost? In a world governed by speed, efficiency, and short-term returns, maintaining a massive structure built according to the logic of another era became a continuous challenge, one that required not only money, but patience, judgment, and ethical choice. Biltmore entered the modern age as a complex institution. It was at once a historic landmark, a cultural destination, and an economic entity required to sustain itself. Each day, the estate functioned like a small city, preserving architecture, managing visitor flows, maintaining landscapes, and continually retelling its own story in ways accessible to contemporary audiences. There was little room left for romantic idealism. Every decision passed through the lens of sustainability. Tension between preservation and commerce became the defining issue. To generate the resources necessary for survival, Biltmore expanded its visitor services, exhibitions, and cultural events. Yet each expansion carried risk. Allowing large numbers of people to move through fragile 19th century interiors placed constant strain on the very elements being protected. Biltmore depended on public access for survival, while simultaneously needing protection from the pressures of that access. As society grew increasingly attentive to questions of inequality and historical power, the narrative surrounding the estate continued to evolve. Topics once treated cautiously were addressed more directly: where the wealth came from, whose labor sustained the estate, and what long-term social consequences the Gilded Age produced. Biltmore was no longer presented as a simple success story, but as a complex historical case in which beauty and imbalance existed side by side. For many visitors, the modern Biltmore experience became less about admiration and more about contemplation. Walking through vast spaces, guests confronted a past that could not and perhaps should not be repeated. The estate functioned as a reflective surface, inviting comparison between the values of an earlier era and the priorities of the present. In that comparison, Biltmore offered no moral instruction, but neither did it conceal uncomfortable truths. At a deeper level, preserving Biltmore raised a broader question about how societies choose what to remember. Not every grand estate survives. Not every private dream becomes shared heritage. Biltmore's endurance owes something to its uniqueness, but also to repeated decisions across generations that preserving a complicated symbol was more valuable than erasing it. That choice was never self-evident, and it remains open to debate. Standing before Biltmore in the modern era, one sees more than a chateau or a country estate. One sees an ongoing negotiation between past and present. Every restored stone, every trimmed garden, every carefully framed narrative represents a moment in that negotiation. Biltmore survives not because it is fixed in time, but because it has accepted change as the cost of not being forgotten. This part of the story does not resolve the tension, it deepens it. For when a legacy enters the present, it no longer belongs solely to the past. It becomes a responsibility of the living, who must decide what to preserve, how to tell the story, and what lessons to carry forward from a dream of luxury that once grew beyond control. By the time Biltmore's story reached its mature place in historical memory, what mattered most was no longer the numbers, the rooms, or the architectural details. What remained was the sense of a completed life cycle that had not vanished. Biltmore did not collapse like so many extravagant symbols of the Gilded Age, nor did it freeze into a lifeless museum. It continued to exist present yet restrained, carrying layers of meaning that no single generation could ever fully claim. This is what makes Biltmore a singular case in American heritage. It does not stand as an unqualified triumph, because the cost of building and sustaining it is always visible. Yet neither is it a complete failure, because careful adaptation allowed it to survive the major ruptures of the 20th century. Biltmore occupies a difficult middle ground, where history offers no final verdict, only space for reflection. For modern society, the estate has become a test of how we confront the legacies of power and wealth. Preserving Biltmore does not require endorsing everything that produced it. Instead, it provides a physical setting in which complex questions can be asked and held. Visitors are invited not only to consider how such a place was built, but why a society once permitted it to be built in that way. In this sense, Biltmore clarifies the difference between memory and nostalgia. Nostalgia smooths the rough edges of the past, transforming imbalance into beauty alone. Memory preserves discomfort alongside admiration. When told honestly, Biltmore belongs to memory, not nostalgia. It does not ask for unconditional reverence. It asks for attention with responsibility. Seen across its full arc, the estate reveals that the deepest tragedy was not that luxury once grew beyond control, but that such dreams were assumed to stand outside time. Biltmore proves the opposite. It survives today not because it resisted history, but because it allowed itself to be questioned, reinterpreted, and drawn into conversations its founder could scarcely have imagined. This part of the story, therefore, does not close with a definitive conclusion. It pauses in an open state. Biltmore remains where it has always stood, continuing to attract attention, continuing to provoke debate, and continuing to remind us that every symbol of beauty and power carries historical responsibility. The story does not end when the narration stops. It continues in how each generation chooses to see, understand, and engage with what has been left behind. Looking back on the full journey of Biltmore, what ultimately remains is not its scale, nor the luxury that once astonished its earliest visitors. What endures is a question that stretches across more than a century. What should a society do with dreams built from resources far beyond the needs of a single lifetime? In that sense, Biltmore is not a declaration, but an ongoing conversation. George Vanderbilt built this estate with the belief that culture and beauty could be cultivated through wealth, and that setting a high aesthetic standard might help a young America gain confidence as a civilization. At its beginning, that belief was not entirely misguided. Biltmore did become a rare place where knowledge, architecture, and landscape were brought together with intention. But history does not judge a creation solely by its original intent. It measures it by the human and social consequences that unfold over time. The price of luxury pushed beyond control did not arrive in a single dramatic collapse. It arrived slowly, quietly, through decades of maintenance, through forced adjustments, through the gradual transformation of a private dream into a collective burden unless redefined. Biltmore survived not because it escaped that reality, but because it accepted a change in purpose from private possession to shared space of memory and learning. In the modern world, the estate no longer asks for unconditional admiration. It exists as an open historical text, allowing visitors to experience beauty while also confronting the imbalances that made that beauty possible. In an age where new symbols of power rise and fall with speed, Biltmore reminds us that endurance does not come from avoiding difficult questions, but from allowing those questions to remain visible. The story of Biltmore, then, is not only the story of a family or a building. It is the story of how a society chooses to confront its own past. Preservation is not the same as celebration. Erasure is not the same as resolution. Between these extremes lies the difficult work of responsible remembrance, where heritage is kept not to glorify power, but to understand its limits. When visitors leave Biltmore, what lingers is rarely the impression of wealth alone. What stays longer is a sense of time, of choices once made, and of the long shadows those choices cast. The estate stands no longer as a monument to personal ambition, but as a quiet reminder that every great dream must eventually answer to the community, to history, and to responsibilities that outlive the dreamer. And in that quiet, Biltmore completes its final role, not as a symbol of victory, nor as a simple warning, but as a place where past and present meet, allowing us to look back, not to return, but to better understand the path still ahead. Long after the final stone was set and the last corridor furnished, the land surrounding Biltmore continued its own quiet transformation. The forests, once aggressively cleared and reshaped to serve a grand European vision, began to mature into something neither entirely natural nor entirely artificial. They became a living archive bearing the marks of human ambition, scientific intervention, and the slow reclamation of time. Unlike many estates of its era, Biltmore's landscape was never abandoned to chance. From the beginning, it had been managed with intention, guided by early principles of modern forestry and conservation. Over decades, these practices allowed the land to recover from the initial shock of construction. Trees grew taller, soil stabilized. Wildlife returned in patterns that reflected both intervention and restraint. The result was not wilderness, but continuity, a reminder that even controlled environments evolve beyond their creators. This continuity matters, because it reveals a dimension of Biltmore often overlooked. While the house itself stands as a monument to fixed design, the land surrounding it tells a more fluid story. It demonstrates how human systems, once imposed, must eventually negotiate with ecological reality. In that sense, the estate became an early, imperfect experiment in coexistence between wealth-driven development and long-term stewardship. For later generations, this aspect of Biltmore added a new layer of meaning. Visitors no longer encountered only architecture and interiors, but a landscape shaped by decisions made over a century earlier. Walking through these grounds became a lesson not only in aesthetics, but in consequence. Every path, every open vista, every preserved forest carried evidence of choices that extended far beyond the life of the man who ordered them. In this way, the land itself became a narrator. It spoke without words, reminding observers that while buildings can freeze moments in time, landscapes expose duration. They record patience, error, correction, and resilience. Biltmore's survival, then, was not only architectural or cultural. It was ecological, and that survival carried its own quiet authority. In the end, Biltmore's greatest significance lies not in what it once represented, but in what it continues to provoke. It no longer functions as a promise of what wealth can build. Instead, it operates as a question posed gently, persistently, to every generation that passes through its gates. Ambition created Biltmore, but ambition alone could not sustain it. What endured was adaptation, reinterpretation, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The estate survived because it ceased insisting on a single meaning. It allowed itself to be read differently across time as aspiration, excess, warning, achievement, and memory, all at once. This is the quiet power of enduring places. They resist closure. They refuse to settle into a single lesson. Instead, they remain available for reflection, shaped as much by those who encounter them as by those who first imagined them. Biltmore, in this sense, no longer belongs to George Vanderbilt, nor even to the Vanderbilt family. It belongs to the ongoing dialogue between past and present. As history continues forward, the estate stands not as an endpoint, but as a pause, a moment where scale forces humility, where beauty demands context, and where legacy becomes less about ownership than about responsibility. The question Biltmore leaves behind is not whether such a place should exist, but whether we are willing to understand fully what it took to create it, and what it asks of us now. And so the story does not truly conclude. It settles into stone, into forest, into memory, and into the space between admiration and accountability, where history does its most honest work.